Well, good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here this evening, and those who are online, it's good to have you with us as well. My name is Reverend Eric Hooka. I'm the Director of Continuing Education here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and I am pleased to welcome you in person and online to our 2025 Albright-Deering Lecture in Methodist Studies. It's co-sponsored by our Western Pennsylvania Conference, the United Methodist Church. And as we were planning this year, we were recognizing how difficult it is to be a ministry leader, whether lay or clergy, in these days. For years, many congregations have been enduring what I've often called the triple whammy of political and social polarization and a global pandemic, an overall decline in religious participation in a lot of places in America. And for those of us who are United Methodist, we love quadrantals so much we had a fourth one added on with the additional disruption of disaffiliating churches and clergy, and in some cases that was here and elsewhere carried out through unholy conferencing and conflict. And so weariness, I think, is understandable. But inertia and despair are not inevitable. Crises and challenges also bring opportunity, and in this moment, many congregations are feeling the freedom to explore new directions, to discover hope and renewed energy, and to build on their founding values and core purpose in discerning the next faithful steps that God has for their congregation. So these topics, these themes, and more is what you will hear today. In today's lecture titled, What Do We Do Now? Rebuilding After the Storms Have Passed. And our lecturer this afternoon, which we will introduce in a moment, is the Reverend Dr. Lovett Weems, the Distinguished Professor of Church Leadership and Senior Consultant of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary. But first, a word about these lectures. The Albright-Deering Lectures in Methodist Studies were established in 1999 through individual contributions and a generous gift from Joseph and Gail Deering of Dayton, Ohio, to celebrate Joseph's career accomplishments and to honor their former pastor, the Reverend Dr. H. Pat Albright. The lectureship is intended to bring outstanding scholars in the Wesleyan tradition to the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary community. Joseph W. Deering was a graduate of Harvard University and Stanford University. He came to Pittsburgh in 1980 as the president of Elger Plumbing Ware. The following year, his family became active in Mount Lebanon United Methodist Church and began a lifelong friendship with the Albrights. Reverend Dr. H. Pat Albright was an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, serving 3 churches in his 38 years of active ministry. Wesley United Methodist in Newcastle, PA, First United Methodist in Erie, PA, and Mount Lebanon United Methodist from 1978 until his retirement from active ministry in 1994. During his life, Pat also served here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, both as adjunct faculty in homiletics and on the PTS Board of Directors from 1989 to 1998, and then as an emeritus member of the board until his death in 2014. By all accounts, he was a true Methodist, passionate about education and scholarship, not for the sake of only acquiring knowledge, but for the strengthening of ministry in local churches. Now, since, for those of you who have been at these lectures in previous years, you may remember that since Reverend Albright's death in 2014, his wife, Betty Lou Albright, has continued to attend these lectures for most of the past decade. But unfortunately, Betty Lou was unable to be with us here this afternoon, and I think many of us feel her absence as we gather. Later this winter or spring, I want you to know that representatives from both the seminary and from the conference are going to visit Betty Lou and deliver her an arrangement of flowers as we have begun to do or customarily done in previous years. And we also, I wanted to let you know that I put out some note cards in the back of the sanctuary on that table to my left, your right. They're Pittsburgh Seminary note cards. And if you want to write a note to Betty Lou, if you know her or not, and you want to write a note and just let her know that you're thinking about her and missing having her here, and you feel so led, I'd invite you to write that note to her. And you could do that at any time when we're here in the chapel, and then we'll take it over to dinner too, take those cards over so that you can continue to write those notes for her. And while we're on the subject of writing note cards, the title of today's lecture has been an interesting one for me to be thinking about, because it's what do we do now rebuilding after storms have passed? And it was meant when we wrote it to be metaphorical, but in these weeks leading up to the event, I've been thinking a lot about someone who's literally rebuilding after storms, and that is a dear friend of many of us, both here at the seminary and here in the conference, and that's Reverend John Shaver. As you might know, John is a child of the annual conference. He's ordained here, and he served churches here early in his ministry. He's also a 98 graduate of Pittsburgh Seminary, and he currently serves on our board of directors. And so, if you haven't heard the news, John serves as the pastor of Pacific Palisades United Methodist Church, which is one of the communities and churches most impacted by the LA wildfires last month. So both the church and most church members' homes, including John's, were a total loss. And so in the months and years to follow, I've been thinking about how John will literally be rebuilding after those wildfires, rebuilding his congregation, rebuilding his community. And so if you feel that, I also invite you to use those note cards to send some well wishes and prayers to John from this gathered community, and we will make sure to get those to him. And if you're online, if you would like to send a note to either Betty Lou or John, you can email your message to coned, CONED, @pts.edu by the end of this week, and we'll make sure to get it to them. You're welcome to submit any questions at any time in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can if you're online. And for those of you here, we'll have a chance for you to ask questions afterwards and continue to ask questions when we gather for dinner. And so at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Reverend Dr. Asa J. Lee, to come and introduce our lecturer.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad to have you here. Today is Methodist Day. Yay, United Methodist Day here at PTS. We are so grateful for the legacy of Pat Albright and Betty Lou. I am one that is missing her presence. We often have a wonderful time talking about the children, our children, Chinda and I's children with her. And the Deering family for their gift. We're grateful for the legacy that we have in them. It's interesting that you mentioned John Shaver. I was just texting with him today about his plans and what he's looking to do. We're going to be seeing him next month, and I mentioned to him that you, Lovett, were going to be here, and he said, you know, Lewis Fellows Unite. Yeah. John and I met in a Lewis Fellows program many years ago. It's also where I met Tom in Lewis Fellows program. Lovett gave me my first and second real jobs in theological education. When I was a entering student at Wesley, Lovett had just returned to Wesley Seminary, having retired from St. Paul, and to be the founding director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. And not many people knew what in the world Lewis Center for Church Leadership was back then. It was sort of purported to be, claimed to be sort of the church's think tank, the place where the ideas and issues that affect the church would be addressed. And Lovett was its director. And I was its first graduate assistant. And it was a ragtag bunch of folks trying to figure out what in the world is Lovett talking about. I found Lovett to be, over the years, an individual that was thinking far ahead of the trends and issues that we were facing in front of us. And so there would be many times in those early days that Lovett would come and give me an assignment that would be, take these numbers and put them over here and send it back to me. Okay. I'm a graduate assistant, point and click, done. What I'd later discover is that little bit of data will become a part of a whole study. That will be the purposes of what many in the United Methodist Church come to find the young clergy crisis and other key research points that fuel conversations in the whole denomination. To that end, Lovett was instrumental in helping me to think through my own vocational direction. What do you want to be when you grow up? Question that we often ask ourselves in seminary after we thought we figured it out, and God brings us back to seminary to figure out what in the world we're supposed to be doing. And so I'm grateful for this leader and this ministry that he has. By way of formal introduction, he is the founding director of the Lewis Center beginning in 2003, and after serving 18 years as president of St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City. He is a native of Mississippi and was a local church pastor in that state for many years, and was critical to both theological and social change that was happening at critical times in Mississippi during that period. He has degrees from Millsaps College, Perkins School of Theology, and Wesley Theological Seminary, and is the author or co-author of, by my count, this is my rough count, at least a dozen books, all of which are in the service of helping us think through the work of ministry. If ever the word churchman could come to mind, Lovett is the consummate churchman, dedicated and given his life to the institution, but also the ministry. And we do know that there's a difference, but both are capable of serving Christ. So it's my privilege to welcome, as president of the seminary, welcoming my first boss, the Reverend Dr. Lovett Weems.
So, well, good afternoon, and I'm so very happy to be here, and thank you, Asa, former student and colleague. It's great to be with you. I was here for his inauguration, and when I got back this time, I asked someone, "Is Asa Lee still here?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Well, good." Okay. Chinda I've known since she was a little girl, and her father was in seminary, and so many others of you I've had the pleasure of knowing. So I'm glad to be with you, with those who are participating online as well. What do we do now? Rebuilding after the storms have passed. These are the topics I'm going to move through, beginning with the impact of disaffiliation, then looking at 5 trends we've been monitoring in the 21st century, and then looking to chart a path ahead. And that's where I could have gone in a number of different directions, and I'll be happy in discussion time to talk about any of those. But what I've decided to do is the greatest similarity between the 25% of churches that disaffiliated between 19 and 23 and the 75% that did not disaffiliate is their size. This chart shows churches before disaffiliation by size of attendance, from a low of below 25 in attendance to a high of 1,000 or more in attendance. And you'll notice in virtually every group, those disaffiliating were of the same proportion as those who stayed. In 2019, when disaffiliation began, the median worship attendance, half higher, half lower, median, was 38. The median attendance of disaffiliating churches was 38. Now we get to regional differences, and you can see that over 70% of the disaffiliations came from churches in the southeastern and south central jurisdictions of the church. These are the 2 jurisdictions, except for Kansas and Nebraska, that overlap the heart of the Methodist Episcopal Church south that existed from 1844 to 1939. There were only 10% in the northeastern jurisdiction, but you wouldn't know that if you were from the Western Pennsylvania Conference. Western PA was an outlier in the Northeast. These are the annual conferences that were most impacted by disaffiliation, meaning 30% or more of the churches disaffiliated. Remember, 25% overall did. And you see that Western Pennsylvania appears as the first conference outside the Southeast and South Central jurisdictions to be there. And the one in parenthesis by Western Pennsylvania indicates that it was one of the conferences that the disaffiliating churches had a median attendance of 5% or higher than the overall conference average. So that adds to the impact. The biggest difference between staying and seceding churches comes in the racial ethnic majorities of those congregations. 97.4% of seceding churches were majority white congregations, whereas just under 90% of the congregations overall were white. Now, within that smaller pool of racial ethnic disaffiliations, keep in mind that there was a strong cluster of Korean congregations and of Hispanic congregations where there was never really anything to talk about. They were going. So what it shows is another example of the African American United Methodist being the most loyal constituency the United Methodist Church and its predecessors have ever had. In 1939, the price paid for unifying North and South was the establishment of the segregated central jurisdiction. 50 years after that event, I was in Grand Avenue Temple Church in Kansas City where that conference took place. And I thought about when that vote was taken, not a single African American delegate voted for that plan. And as soon as it passed overwhelmingly, all the delegates stood and started singing, "We're marching to Zion," except for the African American delegates. They remained seated, many crying, including one of the most famous African American Methodists of the time, Mary McLeod Bethune. So, here are 4 trends from the 21st century. And you'll notice that none of them started with the pandemic or with disaffiliation. The first is declining attendance. Some of you remember what it was like in the 1990s. We didn't pay a lot of attention to it at the time, but it was a strong decade for attendance. United Methodist even had gains in attendance during a number of those years, not membership, but attendance. Some other mainline churches did. PCUSA did one year, I think, during that time. Episcopal Church, ELCA. It was a strong time across the country for attendance. 2000 came, and it was strong. And then it peaked upward in 2001. And some of you remember why. For 5 Sundays after 9/11, more people attended church in the United States than had in decades. But after 5 Sundays, attendance turned down, and it has not stopped going down since. We have been in what I call a worship recession. Declining attendance. In 2000, the median attendance was 53. By 2022, it was 25. Second trend is aging church membership. You see 2 things here. One, with the red marks, you see the death rate per 1,000 people of the general population of the country, ages 13 and above. And the blue marks show the death rate for United Methodist during that time. And this shows from 1969 to 2019. Now notice at the beginning, you see it was in the 1960s when we stopped growing. Back when we were growing, the average age of United Methodist was significantly younger than that of the general population. And the reason the death rate gives us clues to this is that 75% of all deaths take place among people 65 and above. But notice beginning in the 70s, the death rate for United Methodist went higher, and it stayed significantly higher, meaning older than the population. So for those of you here who are United Methodist, when you're driving home, be very careful. Be very careful. Here's another trend. This is looking at 2000 to 2019. This is how many churches there were in 2019 compared to 2000 based on attendance tiers, beginning on the left with 25 or fewer in worship, and on the right with 1,000 or more in worship. Now, of all churches between 2000 and 2019, there were 5,000 fewer churches. But if you just count the churches that had 26 or more in attendance, there were 7,000 fewer churches, because in 2019, there were 2,000 more churches that had 25 or fewer in attendance. And that's after factoring in that most church closures tend to come from this very smallest group. And the fourth is fewer professions of faith. This chart shows from 1980 to 2022. You can see it, the movement downward. You can also see the very low point in the pandemic year, and you see gradual coming back after that. And not only are the actual numbers declining, but if you look at it proportionately, how many professions of faith are there based on the people you have at that particular time, that shows that our effectiveness in reaching new people has gone down. So, charting the path forward, given our situation now within our churches and within our culture. I talk about rebuilding after a disaster and a tragedy because the pandemic was a disaster, but the disaffiliation was a tragedy. It did not need to happen. But the fact is, if there had been no pandemic, most of our churches would have fewer people today than before the pandemic. Because remember the attendance chart. So what it means is this returning to normal, this thing that since the pandemic, so many churches have been interested in, and so many trying to get things back the way they were before there was that big gap we had in our worship experience. That's not sufficient. Because if we go back and everything's just like it was in 2019 before the pandemic. Well, the fact was in 2019 and 18 and 17 and all those years before, the way we were doing ministry was withdrawing the United Methodist witness from our communities, our states, and our country every single year. So that formula that we had before will simply lead us to more and more heartbreak. So, as I said, I'm dividing the opportunities for this future into two categories. One has to do with those things that we tend to know how to do. We've at least done well somewhere in the past. This is not some strange new something we're doing, but that we've got to get our act together for those things. And then the second set of opportunities comes from those things that we may be trying to do, but we've never done well, sometimes not doing at all. And the reason I'm separating these is because the change model you need for each set is very, very different. And we tend in the church to only know one model of change, and that won't work for all the issues that we're facing. So I'm calling the first group 3 key sustaining opportunities. Now, sustaining change doesn't mean just keeping things going. It's a technical term that refers to change that is most likely to occur in long-established institutions, organizations that have an established constituency. That is, they are more likely to be able to improve something they already have done in the past or know how to do. So let's say here's our imaginary community. And in that community, you've got some of the old established churches, some right across from the courthouse. Many will be named First Church. But you have others. You have a storefront church. You have traditional new church starts. You have some that relocated. You have the new church just outside the city limits that is a gravel parking lot and a metal building. You've got a lot of different churches. Now, if there's a church that has just hired the most talented, most credentialed, most educated, full-time music director that's ever been hired in that community, chances are it's going to come from one of those established churches. If you just heard that a church in the community has just refurbished not only its fellowship hall, but virtually its whole building, it's more than likely that's going to be one of the established churches. If you've heard that a church with a part-time youth minister has just upgraded that to a full-time youth pastor, that's more likely to come from those established churches. So when it's sustaining change, nobody can beat the churches that have been around and they know how to do certain things well. Now, the first of those, I would say, is new and growing disciples. The two lines on this chart represent, the red line represents the same figures you saw on another chart for professions of faith. From the beginning of American Methodism, every year there has always been far, far more professions of faith than deaths until 2019, before the pandemic. And since then, there have been more deaths than professions of faith. Demographers talk about natural increase and natural growth. For instance, after every sentence, every county in the country is designated natural increase, natural decrease. If there are more babies born than people die, that's natural increase. If there are more deaths than births, that's natural decrease. And the reason they pay so much attention to this, if you have natural decrease and it continues for a while, that's when schools consolidate. That's when hospitals close and businesses go somewhere else. So here we're using professions of faith as births into the faith, and then deaths as deaths. We have just about gotten out of the disciple making business. We're very happy to outsource it. That is, if somebody has come to Christ as a Baptist or a Pentecostal or almost anything, and they later move to our community and want to join our church, we'll be happy to take them. But we're tending to outsource the leading people to make that first decision. So what's the answer to this? It's not going to be to have some crusade or quotas or have every church will do X or Y. No. In fact, we may not even use the phrase professions of faith. There's nothing that says we have to use language out of our statistical forms in church. What we need to do is to take a whole different attitude, not just toward those who have never committed to Christ, but everybody in our congregation, and to say to them, this church exists to help every one of you take your next faithful step with God along your discipleship pathway. For some of you, it may be prayer. For some, it may be Bible. For some, it may be your politics. For some, it may be mission and outreach. And for some of you, it may be, I'm lifting my hand. I'm saying to God, yes, I accept your love made known in Jesus Christ, and I want to begin my discipleship journey. And so I would talk about discipleship journey. I would talk about taking that next faithful step. I'd let the beginning point be the people and recognizing it will be different for every person. But what we're trying to do in everything we do, in our music, in our sermons, in our Lenten studies, everything we do, small groups, it's to try to provide those things that you can take advantage of if you believe they will help you take your next faithful step with God. Second, we've got to engage worship attendance. Every vital church I've come across has two things in common. They are connecting people with God, and they are connecting with their community. Now, there are lots of ways that people connect with God, but the one that we invest the most in is worship. And the key is not whether we had our service or services this week. It's, are they accomplishing what we believe God has called for them to accomplish? So we need to begin right where we are and with the people who are there, not who used to be there, but focus on the future. We're always informed by the past, but our focus has to be strictly on the future. And most of all, we've got to come to see all the people God has given us in our communities as our parish. That's the way John Wesley taught. John Wesley began with people. He didn't begin with clergy. He didn't begin with churches. He didn't even begin with doctrine. Because how can you know what doctrine is relevant until you know someone's circumstances? He started with the people. And so when we do our planning, we need to have all the people God has given us in mind as our parish. That's the parish concept Wesley knew, and it was the parish concept in the early years of New England colonies. In the parish church, everybody in the community had some claim on that church, and the church had a claim to benefit them, whether they were members there or not. So I'm suggesting a new measure for making worship decisions, something like, our church will offer worship so that ever more people engage with God's love through Jesus Christ. Think about those decisions you had to make after in-person worship resumed from the pandemic. Do we go back to 2 services or just 1? Do we have a choir or not? Do we have the Sunday school or not? Most of those decisions were made based on the preference of the people sitting around the table. And maybe on the people who had to do the work for those services. This is different. For instance, what time will we have worship? Well, the first thing now you're going to ask is, well, we've been considering these 3 times. Will any one of those times make it more likely than not that we might reach ever more people God has given us in our community? Or is there one of those times that would make it less likely? You see? But that has to do with what we preach. It has to do with what we sing. It has to do with everything we think about our church. Because now we're not like a private club for our members, but we are a mission agency, and all of us are the ministers in ministry to our community. The third sustaining challenge is financial sufficiency and sustainability. And many of you are acutely aware of the pressures there. Every year you should have 2 financial goals as you go into a year. One is to take all the income you expect and use it in the best way to fulfill your mission. And the second is to do that in such a way that's sustainable in the years to come. To not do that can be very selfish. We've got to be thinking ahead. Survival is not a worthy goal, but sustainability of a vital mission is. So if what you're doing is good, then it should be continued. You have to think about sustainability. The 2 kind of rules for sustainability are Your operating expenses all come from recurring and predictable income. Now, I know some of you are in situations now where that's not the case. Think about a 2 or 3 year strategy of getting rid of that. Now, what about other income, non-recurring, non-predictable? Someone leaves money through a bequest, or there's a one-time gift, or some special money comes in, or there's some funds over here given for some purpose that no longer exists. That's what you need to use for capital expenses, because capital, by its definition, has a life longer than a year. Use it for painting and the roof and equipment and technology. Use it to pay down debt. Use it for an endowment if you have one. Use it for a reserve fund if you don't have one. But remember, reserve funds are not to cover recurring deficits. Reserve funds are things that when you made your budget, you had no way of knowing they would happen. The pandemic, a plant closes, the 3 of the top donors in the church die in the same year. That's when you need a reserve fund. And new income sources, that's the cutting edge. You know, the church through its history has all kind of different ways to fund itself. Now, the model we most are familiar with now is a free will offering by the members. That came at a point in our American history where it fit the circumstances, and it's worked very well. But doesn't have to be the only model. There's nothing sacred about that. So churches are looking at, do they have more land than they need? Do they have some space they're not using that could be used to generate income that then could be converted to ministry? This is going to continue to be a cutting edge in the years to come. Now we move to disrupting opportunities. Disrupting doesn't mean creating chaos, but it's a technical term for change that normally occurs among newer organizations and organizations that tend to be reaching previously unserved or underserved people. And they often do it by means that to established folks seem less quality than the conventional standards. So let's go back to our community we had before. Established, new churches, storefront, metal building, relocation. Here's a storefront church that, among other reasons, they didn't have any other option. They had their vacation Bible school at a city park across from a housing project. This church with the metal building, they started a biker ministry. Those are the things that are more likely not to occur at First Church, but at others. Now, there is nothing that needs stop the established churches from having their Bible school in the city park across from a housing project. But they're not going to do it because that's not who they are. They could start a biker ministry. It might be hard since a lot of them don't have anybody with a tattoo, much less a motorcycle, but they could. They've got enough money, they could just about do what they wanted to, but they're not going to do that because that's not who we are. But what happens is those things that start out in a storefront, start out in a metal building, they don't stay that way. You know, those foreign cars that came in all at the bottom, not very high quality, all of a sudden now It's Lexus and Genesis. You see? The car companies at first didn't pay them any attention because they were only competing with them on the lowest priced cars where they don't make much margin anyway. They kept making improvements and increasing the cost of the higher cars where they make the most profit. So that all of a sudden, the church with that gravel parking lot now is paid. Their pastor who painted houses during the week now all of a sudden is full-time out there. And he's getting a haircut a little more often. You know, dressing a little better. No, these things don't stay that way always. Okay. So these are three things that we're either not doing or not doing well that, given our context, are going to be critical to the future. One is racial and ethnic diversity. I list this under disrupting, not because there's not a commitment to diversity, and not because there is not some significant diversity, especially at the upper levels of leadership in the denomination. But I put it here because United Methodist and other mainline denominations have never demonstrated that they can reach any group, any racial group of people other than white people as well as they reach white people. These charts, the one on the left is the 10 years before 2020. It's the change in racial population. You'll notice, and I know these are hard to read, but you can see the main point. Every racial ethnic group other than whites has grown in population. Whites have decreased. To the right, you see the 3 years after the 2020 census. You see the same pattern. Every racial and ethnic group growing in population except for the white population. Take the state of Georgia. It was in the top 5 fastest growing states in the 3 years after the census. But there are fewer whites living in Georgia than in 2020. And 100,000 more African Americans living in Georgia than in 2020. So the second disrupting challenge is economic and social diversity. Methodism started among the poor, but we've gotten away from that very quickly. What I'm showing here in this chart is, you see in the red bars, that's where people live based on the median household income in quintiles. So on the left, where it's the $1 sign, that's the lowest 20% of median income in the country. And you see in the red line how many people live in those areas. And the blue bars show how many United Methodist members live in those areas. And you'll see the bottom 2 quintiles, there are far, far fewer United Methodists living there than in the top 3 quintiles, with the most living where the median household income is the highest of all. And that continues. One more. I see this as becoming champions of the common good. God's will for everyone in our communities is to have the abundant life. But because of decline and controversy, We've really gotten away from that. We've turned inward. Instead of saying with Wesley, I look upon the world as my parish, we say, I look upon our parish as my parish as the world. And we live there. I'd love for the time to come when every United Methodist Church in our denomination is known by everyone as those who are concerned for the common good. And so we want to say to people in our community, our church seeks God's abundant life for all of our members, but also for our entire community. That's because when we think about what we do, we begin by thinking about all the people that God has given us. We need a new paradigm of community engagement. For some of our churches, we have no community presence at all. And then in some cases, when we do engage the public arena, we do it no differently than secular institutions do. We're just as polarizing, we caricature. We need to be the people who can always be counted on to listen to people on any side of the issue and try to bring people together and see out of this what's the common good. There's not going to be agreement, but we're going to discern what the common good is. That's why Methodism historically has supported public education, no matter where someone's child goes, public education, because that's on behalf of the common good. Now, John Wesley practiced this. John Wesley lived in a time of rampant alcoholism and alcohol abuse. If a member of the society asked Wesley what they should do about alcohol, he would have simply said it's an abomination against God, period. But when Wesley went out in the public, the political office holders trying to impact legislation, he didn't talk about an abomination before God. He talked about the common good. He talked about how much grain was being diverted from food products for alcohol. He talked about how many work days were lost every year because of alcohol abuse. He talked about what we'd call today domestic violence at the hands of people abusing alcohol. He was not asking them to do the religious business for the church. He was advocating on behalf of the common good. And it's not because we think it's right, it's because we believe that among the religious and non-religious people, this is the common good. Now, my reason for dividing these two is that they use different models. And our current situation, that's who we are, how we're doing things now, that's where we need the sustaining. But for the future, and we know if we take our current and we just age it 20 years, it's probably not going to look like the current anymore. The future, and that's what we don't know how to do. That's what we don't have a plan for. So this is what we know how to do. We know how to do sustaining change. You develop a plan to improve, you implement, you have improved ministry. Your church, say, has the best food pantry in the community. And one reason is every year you look at it and you talk about how to improve it. Should we do more training for volunteers? Recruiting volunteers? Do we have enough space? What about our hours? And you come up with a plan to improve it. And a year later, you've got an improved ministry. We know how to do that. The problem is that's the only model we know. And so when we're going to try to do something that we have no track record of doing well, we're going to use the same dadgum formula. Church hasn't had a youth ministry in 25 years. What do? We grab some people here and here and here and here, and we brainstorm. We could paint the youth room. We could recognize high school seniors. We could hire a summer part-time intern. And then we do it. And we just hope to high heaven something good happens. And normally it doesn't. Because if you haven't done it for 25 years, what makes you think that the people who have been there not doing it for 25 years have all the wisdom you need to do it? It is crazy, but that's all we know how to do. If we're trying to do something that we're not doing well, we have to use a different formula, and this is it. You start with the desired outcome. You have to know what the harvest is before you know what seed to plant, what season to plant it in, what land to use to plant it, whether you're going to need irrigation or fertilizer. You've got to figure out what is the harvest we see. So here's an example of a harvest. Our church will become more representative of the people God has given us in our community. So if that were your harvest, your goal, become more representative of the community, what would the first thing you'd have to learn be? What's the makeup of the community? What's the second thing you'd have to learn? What's the makeup of the congregation? And then you'd see there's some groups of people that we reach better than they're represented in the community. We celebrate that. Why in the world would they want to come here instead of someone else? What about us draws them here? What keeps them coming back? But then you start looking at other people. So then you got to keep learning. Where are some churches where there's greater diversity than we have? Let's talk to them. Doesn't matter what the denomination is. What are some books on the subject? Who can begin doing some reading? Who are some key people we need to talk to that may not be local, but may be willing to talk to us? How do we just learn and learn and learn? And out of that, the learning, we do some initial plans. We try this, we try that. But the goal is not to implement the plan. The goal is, what did we learn from what we did? Because you see, we're willing to redo anything except the desired harvest. And then you continue to evaluate, learn, keep learning, keep learning. You know, the product WD-40. Recently, my wife said the front door has a knob that it's hard to get it to work, and when it does, it squeaks so loud. So I went and got some WD-40 and put that on there. And I said, well, try it now. Oh, it's a miracle. I kind of hid the WD-40 and went back and put it out. You know where that name came from? It was the 40th formula that they tried before it worked. So, have you tried? Have you had a youth ministry? No, we tried that one time, Pastor. Okay. Well, what about the second time? What about the 39th time? You see? That's what we're talking about. So I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Some of you already get the Lewis Center's Leading Ideas, which is a free online newsletter, comes out every Wednesday morning. But if you go to churchleadership.com, you can subscribe to that. A lot of free resources there. I have some of my books are in the back if you'd like to look. One of them, for those of you who are Leading Ideas subscribers, it's a collection of the Right Questions for Church Leadership. That's a segment we have every week in the newsletter, and that's just has come out from Abingdon Press. So we have a microphone for anyone.
Yeah, so if you're online, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A. We don't have any right now online, so I'm going to open it up just to those of you who are in the room. If you have any questions, you can just come up and use the microphone here, and I'll jump in if we get any from on.
Hi, Professor Weems. I am wondering about those profession of faith statistics and related to the whole new membership thing, and whether that's influenced by the distrust of institutions that everyone keeps talking about with younger people. Because I have some very faithful younger people who started attending while I was there, right at my 2 small churches, and they keep attending. But if I talk membership with them, they're sort of backing away.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I do. That's why I think we've got membership. Sounds like we want somebody to do something for us. Where it's taking our next faithful step sounds like something we really want for them. And so, with our focus on membership, let's say in a church that has some growing possibilities, usually there'll be a prospect list, some people who are attending but haven't joined. And so you're thinking about, what do I do next on that? But when somebody joins, they move off that list. You're now looking at the other people on that list. That's terrible, see. A person in North Carolina told me about attending church for 7 or 8 weeks. Oh, it was amazing. Every week there was something else, oh my, like I was the most important person in the world. And then she joined the church, and she hasn't heard from anybody since about that. And so that's what, but if our focus is for everyone taking their next faithful step, then what you do is, I know many of you participate, not members, and that's fine. That's fine. But all of us get to points in our lives when there's a time for us to make a next step, or some of you have heard us talk a lot about John Wesley or about Methodism, and that's not your background. You'd like to learn more. Well, we have some times we can think about that. So the first is to find a way to frame it. It's not about you, not about the church, but about them. But what you want for them is no different from what you want from everybody else. How are you? What is it? Instead of saying, would you like to be a member? I've been so struck by your commitment. Where is God working in your life? Where are the growing edges for you? Because you can say to people, if you ever had the experience that there's something in your spiritual life that you kind of struggle with, and then you really work at it, and in the olden days, we would have said you finally get the victory over it, all of a sudden, and you're feeling so good, you're about to sprout wings, you're feeling so good. And then all of a sudden, God shows you some other area where you haven't even started. That's the kind of language we use, you see, but it's got to be about them. The starting point is with the people, not with us, not with our categories. We offer Lenten studies. We offer those studies, say, well, folks, every year we have 3 Lenten studies, and one's a Bible study. Usually the pastor leads it. That's usually the most popular one. And then we have 2 more studies. And I hope that everyone, under the sound of my voice, will sign up before you leave today. That's inside out. Yeah, I'm sitting in the pew, I'm saying they want me to do something for them. But if you said, Some of you didn't grow up as United Methodists. Some of you grew up where the Lenten season was not observed. But in any case, it is a time of spiritual assessment, renewal. And your church, you have a right to expect of your church to offer things that can be of help to you. And so this year we've got these 3 studies coming. And one is an advanced Bible study. Some of you say, I love my Sunday school class, but sometimes I just want to dig a little deeper. This class is for you. Then we're going to have another Bible class. It's called Bible 101. It's for the folks of you who say, if you want me to find something in the Bible, you better give me a page number. I didn't grow up with the Bible. So this will be for you. And then we've noticed there's been a lot of tragedy in our church, a lot of loss, deaths, unemployment. We're going to offer a course this Lent on dealing with loss as a person of faith. Now, if any one of these 3 would be of help to you as you take your next faithful step, we want you to know they're available for you. Now, if I'm sitting in the pew, I'm hearing something very different now. I'm hearing these are some things from me. I don't have to do it. But you know, dadgummit, I'm kind of interested in one of those. That's what we're talking about.
So we actually have a follow up to Becky's question and your answer online. Do you see varied categories of congregants in the future other than members, as in like friends or patrons? Do you see a movement towards using different language in different categories?
Yeah, you don't want to do anything that seems like you're separating people. So whether you're talking of all of you or constituents or whatever, but you're going to need to realize that people are sending signals with their different status, such as those that are active, but they are not members. Fewer people are pledging these days. And some churches get very uptight about that, but those that aren't pledging are still giving. No. Don't make them feel bad on it. No, there's some reason for that. That tended to start after the 2008 recession. Also, people are attending more churches than one these days, often online. Somebody told me the other day, I watched 3 services on Sunday, you see? So, and sometimes it's physically doing that. So it's, you see where the water's flowing, see where the sidewalks need to be put. I think of paying attention as a spiritual discipline. Pay attention. Think about that thing that you promoted the mischief out of, and it barely happens every year. But then think about the thing that you even forgot to put in a bulletin, and 40 people showed up. You need to say, what's the clue? What's going on? Or somebody all week long wants to talk about something that happened in worship the Sunday before. It was something really was not your cup of tea. But you better look, what was it about that? Was it that other people were involved? Was it because it was this or that? You're looking for those, what are the living edges? What are the dying edges? And so many times we don't see it. It's like walking by the burning bush and say, yeah, that's interesting. Going on. No. If you thought you were going to get 10 people and you got 40 and you have to go to another room and get chairs out of the closet and all those things, you know, some would just get all huffy about, they got to tell us how many they're coming. We got to, No, you're going to say, hey, Sam and Sally, will you grab this? Will you make a note for the door? I'll get this. because there'll be plenty of time to figure out how to get the table set up next time. You see, I want to figure out what in the world's going on here. We've got to be more tuned. Here's a fear I have. There's almost no such thing as a stable church anymore. About 33% are growing. Well over 50% are declining. It only leaves like 10 or 12% that are truly stable in any year. But I get to thinking about, let's think of the course of a week. What the pastor's doing, what the staff's doing, if you have staff, what the members are doing. Most of those activities are based on the assumption, well, we're a pretty stable church. We're not a stable church. And so we've got to rethink. That's especially true for United Methodist clergy, who always can have a tendency to live in our next church, because if we stay long enough, there'll be somewhere else. That's why I couldn't understand all these clergy leaving with disaffiliation. I've known very few pastors who are totally satisfied in the church they had now. But think about it. If you were going to be there the rest of your ministry, what would you be doing differently? Think about what are the things that are going to shape what this church is like 15 years from now. Don't worry about who's going to be there. You're going to work on it. Leaders have to give attention to things for which there's no constituency demanding it. If you just show up and respond to everything that comes along, you'll be perfectly busy all the time. You deliberately have to decide what is critical for this church 10 years, 15, 20 years from now, and how do I arrange to spend time and effort on that and not just live off of the past. Are we at our time?
Yeah, so we don't have any more questions online. We do have, do you have a question, Sarah? Yeah, so I was going to say, if you have one more question, I'm going to let you ask your question because I don't know, are you joining us for dinner, Sarah? Okay, so you can ask your question. The rest of us, most of us, if there's any burning questions you have that you absolutely need to ask before we head to dinner, or if you're not joining us for dinner, I'll invite you to do that now, but then we're going to have plenty of time to have continuing conversation. I think we'll have some good conversation, but Sarah always asks good questions, so I always let her ask one.
Okay. Yeah, thank you a lot to not only think about, but do. So I appreciate that. I'm thinking about those edges of growth that you talked about. You mentioned that, through the history of church in this country, the form has changed, right? Hasn't been consistent. I don't have as long of an institutional legacy as some other folks. So I don't quite have a sense of whether this phenomenon that you named, where when we're trying to project out what future is going to look like 10, 20 years from now, we expect it to look like what it was 50 years ago. Is that normal through the nation's history? And if not, why is that happening now? What are the roadblocks that we're getting stuck on that's causing this sort of damming up of the evolution? Thanks.
We're simply responding the way people always have. There was an era in Methodism where the primary vehicle for spiritual formation was something called the camp meeting. My guess is you had camp meetings in Pennsylvania. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. And this is where almost everybody was farming, but there would be a block of time in the year when they could all come away and they would go to the camp meetings. And for usually 2 weeks, 10 days, it would be a kind of 7-day-a-week church. It would be their Bible school, their women's ministry. It would be everything. You would have preaching 2 or 3 times a day. You'd have singing there. You had something for the children. You had every kind of thing. And then people would go away and come back. And that was very strong. We had got more and more of these camp meetings. But then there was something that started called the Sunday school. And it started in England, started in the United States much in the same way. Remember, the Sunday school in England didn't start out as something purely religious. It was done by the church people. But this was before child labor laws and required education. So it was held on Sunday afternoons, not because it was Sunday, but that was the only day children were off. And they taught them to read, taught them to write, they taught them math, and they taught them religion. And these children often went home and taught their parents. And so later, with required public education and child labor laws, those pieces fell away, and it became a purely religious type thing. In the United States, the Sunday school popped up in all kinds of places. They were held at fire stations or on someone's porch. They could be on Saturday, Sunday, it didn't matter. And at annual conferences, people would tell these glowing reports about their Sunday school. And some of the elders of the conference would get up and say that, this thing you're talking about, the Sunday school, that's fine. God bless you. But what we need to realize is we're going to lose a few more camp meetings this year if we don't do something. You see, there wasn't even a form on the statistic report for Sunday school. But the Sunday school became that field of energy that really led to about 100 years. It was not until the 1960s that worship attendance was more than Sunday school attendance. In the 1950s, if a church had a Sunday school attendance of 800, they'd have a worship attendance of about 500. It was the Sunday school. So the Sunday school has been going down. So we've either got to refurbish that, redo something, or find what's that next one. John, you've been wanting to ask something.
It's my new voice. That's my voice. Camp meetings. Yeah, camp meetings. So the Archives and History Commission of the United Methodist, this particular conference of the United Methodist Church has a record of a camp meeting. The founder of a layman, who happened to be the founder of Methodism in Pittsburgh, John Renshaw, he was a merchant. He went to a camp meeting and he kept a record. And that record was actually handed to me by a member of the Renshaw family a number of years ago. I'm probably the oldest human being in the room. Yeah, I guess I am. I mean, I was born in May of '39. That date ought to mean something to Methodists in America. Get that?
Yeah, that's right. We got to have a camp meeting sermon, otherwise. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. But it's hard. And what's happening now is when those cutting edges appear, if you turn that over to the people who've been running everything for years, they're going to remake it in their image because that's all they know. But what you need is not to devalue what has been, because anything you devalue, people will cling more closely to it. What you need to do is keep a presumption of grace, be positive. What you need from people who have been there forever, you need their cooperation, you need their support, you need their money, you need their interest. You need to stay connected. But the shaping of this new is going to have to come from wisdom beyond what's already there. And so if you want to reach younger people in your church, you better make dadgum sure that the ministries for older people don't miss a beat. Because in the church, almost no one person can say yes to something and make it happen. But almost any group within a church, if they decide it's going to stop, can sabotage it and stop it. So it's not that it's playing off. It's you've got to honor, but you do it in a way that keeps some freedom there so that things can, if you turn the Sunday school over to the camp meeting people, it would have become more like a camp meeting. So it's a time of transition. It's a tough time to be a leader. Thank you.
Thank you.